So our next speaker at our mini conference is David Shatz. David earned his PhD at Columbia, and he's currently professor of philosophy and co-chair of the department at Yeshiva University, as well as chair of the Division of Humanities there. He's written extensively in Jewish philosophy and in general philosophy. His work focuses on theory of knowledge, free will, ethics, and philosophy of religion, as well as on Jewish ethics, Maimonides, Judaism and science, and 20th century rabbinic thinkers. His most recent books include Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook in Jewish Spirituality, and he also has 3 recent anthologies in philosophy of religion. He's also the author of Peer Review, A Critical Inquiry, and Jewish Thought in Dialogue. And you should know he's appeared on several episodes of PBS too, so he's a television personality. As well, he's an ordained rabbi, and most recently he was awarded the Presidential Medallion at Yeshiva University, the first member of the faculty to receive what is Yeshiva's highest award. He's going to speak to us today on Is Humility Always a Virtue? Reflections on its role in Jewish theology and law. So please welcome David with me.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. You have the handout. The reason I gave the handout is that this talk covers a lot of ground. And I was conscious of the story that Woody Allen tells about a guy who took a course in speed reading, and they asked him later, how was it? And he said, oh, it was great. I read War and Peace in an hour. It's about Russia. I was afraid that would be the effect here. Groucho Marx once said, or said more than once, he said, these are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others. Now, philosophers know this idea under different names, or something like this idea. It's not exactly the same. Conflicts of values, defeasible obligations, trumping, and so forth. What I'd like to talk about today is how humility can come into conflict with other values, and what some Jewish sources say about such conflicts, as well as having some general philosophical reflection that will, I think, attach to other religions as well. In addition, I think what I'm going to try to show, what I hope that I will show, I think I will show, whatever, is that your religious traditions face certain issues about humility that are really unique to their belief system, or if not unique, then certainly very distinctive of them. I'm going to try to identify and analyze some of those. Before I get to that, I want to report 2 reactions I had when I first started to research this topic a while back. One was I read an article by Gerald Steinberg in an anthology about top concepts in Jewish thought, where he said, he had an article on humility, and he basically said humility has come upon hard times. He said after the critiques of Marx, not Groucho, Karl, right, Freud, Nietzsche, Schleiermacher, he said that religion entails what he summarized as social paralysis, infantile dependency, and obsequious obedience. Now, some of these very characteristics had been celebrated by religions. In Judaism, for example, certain movements, I know this is true of other religions too, demanded self-abasement, self-abnegation. And so, although maybe humility isn't self-abnegation, we'll get to that later, nevertheless, superficially, it looks too close for comfort, and as you know, Nietzsche famously denounced humility. And the critique of religion was that it had too much stress on humility. More recently, I was doing work on neo-atheism, actually for a book that Howie Wetstein edited. The neo-atheist attack struck me as completely the opposite. It's the attack is that religion is unyielding, that it is not humble, that it does not respond to reasons, which of course is a far cry from the imputed religious anthropology of weakness against which the earlier attacks was leveled. So one thing that struck me is the shift. And in that context, secularism describes itself as humble, because it is ready to revise belief. Now, whether it's true that secularism also manifests dogmatism and I call it epistemic recalcitrance or epistemic intransigence, whether that's the case, that's a separate matter that that I actually tried to discuss in that article. I'm already very self-referential, which is not a sign of humility. That's one reaction that I had. The other reaction that I had is just how difficult it is, as I started to think about this, how difficult it is to decide who is humble and who is arrogant. I mean, imagine the following conversation taking place between a religious believer and the critic. The believer says, I am humble. I God's will. Humble submissive, the term we hear all the time. No, you're not humble because you don't respond to reasons. No, you're not humble. It's beginning to sound like first grade. No, you're not humble because you put all this trust in reason. No, that's humble because we revise. So you revise. That means that you yourself don't really trust reason. And so the conversation would go. I think the fact that I wasn't able to resolve this in my mind turned out to be emblematic of the entire topic. Because as you will see, and I suppose this is very much in the Jewish spirit, you're going to probably wind up with more questions than answers, and I will be posing more questions than answers. I ask you now to go to the handout. I will begin with some Jewish texts about humility. There's certainly much more here than I'm going to talk. I'm going to pick out just a couple of things. Here you have to start on page 3. Page 3 is where the sources start, and there's kind of information overload here, but you'll at your leisure, if you have any, you can go through these. The first, I divided this into 3 parts. First, there is general praise of humility. Now, in that general praise of humility in Judaism, you'll have some very well-known things. Moses, the characteristic of Moses as described is that he was more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. Abraham said, I am dust and ashes. There are statements in the Talmud that humility is the greatest of all virtues. God is said in Jewish tradition to be humble, and it says, in fact, source 5 here, wherever you find God's greatness, there also you find his humility. God describes himself as great, and yet he helps the oppressed and the poor. And so on and so forth. And then you get, if you go to number 9, you get a more extreme affirmation of the importance of humility. Rabbi Levitas of Yavne says, be very, very humble. In Hebrew, that's ma'od, ma'od hevei shefal ruach, because the anticipated end of the human being is worms. Now, it's interesting that Maimonides, who normally follows the doctrine of the Aristotelian mean, in this case, he agrees with Rabbi Levitas. He says that there are two attributes about which Maimonides doesn't agree with Aristotle, where he says you should not go on the mean, you should go on the extreme. One is anger, and the other is humility. So he deviated from Aristotle on this point and accepted number 9. Number 10 is the theme of self-abnegation. That's frankly very, very common among Hasidic thinkers and among thinkers in what's called the Musar movement, which was an ethical movement that arose in the 19th century. Here's typical quotations, not the most famous one. At long last, we discover that there is no ani. In Hebrew, the aleph, nun, yud, and I. There's no ani, but only ha. In other words, if you do a reshuffling of the word ani, you get the word ayin, nothingness. And this, of course, you think of as humility. This is the Hasidic thinkers like to play with these letters. It's not the best one I've heard. The best one I heard is from a non-Hasidic thinker, Samuel David Luzzatto, who was a criticism of he was a critic of rationalist Judaism and rationalism in general, and of Kant. And he said if you take the Hebrew anagram Tanakh, which is the abbreviation for the Bible, Torah, Nevi'im, Uktuvim, and you spell it backwards, you get Kant. So Kant is the Bible in reverse. Okay. Next, let's look at the sources under number 2. Meaning number 2, the second division. Notice the first division I have is general characteristics of humility. The second is what I call intellectual humility and interpretive pluralism. You'll see that those are related. Judaism has a tremendous stress on interpretive pluralism. Obviously there's humility shown by deference to authority, but there's also going to be humility in interpretive pluralism. The most striking and probably the most famous passage here is one that's in number 2, where the Rabbi Abba here speaks about the disputes that took place between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai in the early centuries of the Christian era. And they debated, and in the end, the verdict, now what do I mean by a verdict? Majority rules. Majority rules, and the majority decided in favor of Beit Hillel. And the Talmud asks, why is it that Beit Hillel merited that the majority should choose that way? And if you look at quotation number 2, if you have, actually even if you don't look at the quotation, it's there, okay, but it says both, he says, why, this full line from the bottom of the quote, why did Beit Hillel merit that the halacha should be fixed in accordance with their view? Because nochin va'aluvin hayu, they were easy and forbearing, and they would study their opinion and the opinion of Beit Shammai. In other words, they didn't listen only to themselves. Not only that, but they would mention Beit Shammai's opinion before their own. Now, if you work in academia, of course, that's not a big deal, because usually you set up the other person's opinion in order to kill it. But what they're saying is they really paid attention to Beit Shammai, and that's why the ruling was in their favor. And what's especially striking is that another Mishnah tells us that Beit Hillel reversed itself more than Beit Shammai did. In other words, they kind of, as it were, almost made more mistakes, but they were more revising. Now, you might ask, well, what is this whole thing with being humble and forbearing? Well, how does that bear on the question of whom you rule like? And the answer seems to be because Beit Hillel was emblematic of what discourse should be like. And that's why the law went in their favor. Now, there's a second theme that emerges from these sources. And the second theme is that there are, pardon the exaggeration a little, a zillion ways to look at everything. And the most striking example of this is source number, 6. When Moses ascended to receive the Torah, it was demonstrated to him that every matter was subject to 49 lenient and 49 stringent approaches. And he inquired about this. He said, you have so many different ways to look at it. God responded that the scholars of each generation were given the authority to decide. And you have an idea also, go back up to source 3, 5 lines from the bottom of source 3. You too make your ear like a mill hopper and acquire, I never heard the word before, and acquire a discerning heart. John mentioned discernment, to hear the words of those who pronounce it pure and the words of those who pronounce it impure, the words of those who prohibit and the words of those who permit. In other words, listen carefully to both sides. The words of those who disqualify and the words of those who decide. There is a tremendous emphasis then upon hearing the other side. And in Judaism, minority opinions are recorded in the Talmud. They are preserved, and they are preserved for a reason. It's in order to project this spirit of debate. And in many ways, debate is very much at the center of the life of the Jewish people. Torah is at the center, and in order to keep it at the center, there is debate, 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 debate. There's a joke that's told by one of the eminent rabbis of the 20th century. There's a story in the Talmud that the Septuagint was translated. That the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. You have the story, right? By 70 rabbis, and they all they put in 70 rooms, and they all came out with the same translation. So this rabbi who I'm referring to with the phone Mo, he said, "What's the big deal? You put 70 rabbis in 70 rooms, they come out with the same thing. The trick is to have 70 rabbis in one room and have them come out with the same thing." And source 13 talks about, line 3 of source 13, the entire Torah is called a song whose beauty derives from the interactive diversity of its voices and instruments. One who immerses himself in the sea of Talmud will experience the joy that results from such variety, coming from a thinker of the late 19th century. So far you have then a general characterization of humility, a general lauding of humility, a panegyric to humility, if you will. And then we have this intellectual humility in particular, which goes along here with interpretive pluralism. The third part of this is the one that's most relevant to the theme of the title, is humility of virtue. And these are what I label here on page, your copy, it's page 6, I think. Yeah. texts that sanction a bit of arrogance, pride, sanction in the sense of approve of, pride, arrogance, and self-importance. And I'll just give you 3 quick examples. Number 1, each and every person is obligated to say, the world was created for me. This may seem very strange. To say the least, it seems egocentric. In the context, the Talmud is basically affirming the value of the individual. A few lines earlier, you have the following statement. Anybody who takes a life, who destroys a life, it's as if he destroyed an entire world. Anybody who saves a life, I said takes a life the first time, right? Anybody who saves a life, it's as if he saved an entire world. If you follow through the consequence of that, you, in a sense, should view yourself as an entire world in the purpose of creation. It's not suggested here that you walk around with this idea all day, but there's a kind of dialectic where, on the one hand, you feel this, sort of lowliness, but on the other hand, say this to yourself as well. Number 2 is a statement that a Torah scholar must have an eighth of haughtiness. I don't know how they measured this, how they got exactly to that measure. Now, why do they need an eighth of haughtiness? Well, Rav Huna says, and that crowns as the beard does to a star. In other words, the authority, the scholar, can't simply be one of the guys. He's got to stand out in some way. So let him use 1/64th of arrogance or of pride and project that in order to make himself distinctive. And then number 3, which is almost like a capitalist statement of intellectual work, jealousy and competitiveness among scholars increases wisdom. So, you see there then that Judaism lauds humility, lauds intellectual humility, and at the same time is very cognizant that sometimes humility might not be called for. I'd like to now pick up this theme about when humility is called for and run with it. But to do this, I have to also kind of give you a kind of lay of the land. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, but a lay of the land of what's happening in contemporary analytic philosophy with respect to humility. And here, you can turn to page 1 on the handout. There is a position which is reflected actually in dictionaries, in standard English dictionaries, that the humble person has to have a low estimate of himself. And here you'll see lots of intersection with what John spoke about. There is a general view, though, nowadays, well, at least many believe, that humility can't mean that. That it can't mean the failure to recognize one's traits, abilities, achievements, and importance, or even to underestimate. Now, a lot of this literature was precipitated by Julia Driver, who I know teaches at Washington University, and it's a very fascinating literature. She takes the position that humility does involve ignorance or underestimation, but I'm going to look here at some of the issues that have been raised about that. The first issue, and I listed these because, there are a lot of points flowing around here, and I want to make sure that, you have a record of them to keep it. Okay, the first question is, how can a virtue require vice? It's kind of an Aristotelian type question. Ignorance, how could ignorance require a vice? And it's not only the vice of ignorance, it could also be the vice of self-deception. That's another aspect of this. Secondly, it turns out we'd have an obligation to be ignorant, or to deceive ourselves, assuming you have an obligation to cultivate virtue. Third is the question, how do you go about cultivating such ignorance? I mean, should teachers teach students to misassess themselves? Should you refuse to check your report cards? Should you plug up your ears? Should you master self-deception? Should you run away every time your mother opens her mouth because you know she's going to say something nice about you? I mean, how do you go about this kind of creating this underestimation of your view? Number 4, which I have not seen advanced, it's my own argument here, the graduate school recommendations argument. We're always asked, comment on the student's self-awareness. Now, I would say 80% of the time you don't really know, but the fact that self-awareness is valued brings out the fact that there's something that may be a little clunky about humility, because it may conflict with what is perceived as a virtue, namely self-awareness. 5th on my list here of critiques, these are all criticisms of the view that humility involves some sort of ignorance or underestimation, is that lack of awareness of one's abilities can lead to a lack of confidence, which leads to immobilization. Judges would not want to issue rulings. Surgeons would not operate. People would not believe they had the power to repent. I originally said economists would not make predictions, but that's actually a good thing. Okay? People would not believe they have the power to repent, leading to more sin. Now, this came up before. People might not share ideas because they have no confidence in their ideas. They might abandon truths prematurely. There's a nice quotation, the last, you don't have the last page, on page 6. There's a nice quotation from one of the leading medieval thinkers, Bachya ibn Fakuda, who wrote a work called Duties of the Heart, which speaks about the difference between duties of the limb and duties of the heart, and the importance of the duties of the heart, which really mean heart and mind. He says, he talks about writing this work. And he says, but when I designed to remove this laborious burden from myself and desist from composing this work, in other words, I felt this tremendous task, this tremendous burden. He says, I decided to remove the burden and not to write the work. He said, when I started to think that, I reconsidered. And I became suspicious of myself for having chosen to rest. I thought about why I'm not writing this. And I feared that it was the desire of the evil passion which was placing this thought. In Hebrew, the Yetzer Hara. And I knew that many minds have been lost out of apprehension. This came up a little bit in Howie's question before. And many losses have been caused by fear. There's the fear to rule, the fear to share your ideas. That also came up in the previous session. Quote, vigilance dictates, and he's quoting someone, vigilance dictates that one not be excessively vigilant. And I said, says Bachya, after thinking about all this, if all those involved in good causes and teachers of the straight and correct path were to remain silent and still until they could completely attain their ideal, no one would ever say a word after the prophets being the ones with who receive revelation. So it's these are the social consequences then of stressing the idea that the humble person is ignorant or underestimates his or her own abilities. The more they understand their abilities, the more they realize, well, I should give it a shot. Number 6 is a question that I frankly have not seen raised. Probably somebody brings it up, but I'm wondering about this. And that is, if you really underestimate yourself and you attribute weaknesses to yourself, so it could be that you're going to wind up skimping on the duty of gratitude. Gratitude to God for the talents you actually have, but don't admit to yourself that you have. But it's not strictly a religious idea here. Gratitude to God. Gratitude to parents. Gratitude to teachers who raised us. I mean, at every bar mitzvah I go to, somebody says, and we know that the parents raised this person well, and the person should not be grateful if the kid thinks that he really has no merit. So these are then quite a number of objections. Again, maybe I just read them just to, again, how can a virtue require vice? We'd have an obligation to be ignorant. How would we go about cultivating the ignorance? Then there's the self-awareness, graduate school's argument. Lack of awareness of ability leads to lack of confidence, leads to immobilization. What becomes of gratitude? So, there are a lot of difficulties then with the idea that humility involves some sort of submergence of your, or diminution of the value you assign to self. What are the options? Well, I list 3 here. The first I call the simple expedient. The simple expedient is to deny that humility is a virtue. And you say, look, indeed, humility is ignorance, and therefore humility is a vice. Right? It's also, again, everything here is intersecting with John's talk. Second possibility is to accept it as a virtue, but you're saying essentially, I didn't put it so clearly here on the sheet, but you're saying essentially is that the person who underestimates himself or herself, who we call underestimating, is actually spot on. Because our abilities, our achievements, our traits, they really amount to very little, which moves us in the direction of self-abnegation. That's a second option. I don't like that option because of the issue of gratitude. Once again, you become ungrateful for what things you have. The third option is the one now that I want to look at, which will take about, 10 minutes before I get into the other part of the talk. The third option is to explain or define the term differently. I was actually careful not to explain define, because what I'm going to do is not definition. I'm going to be listing some elements that people associate with humility. I find it extremely hard to come up with necessary and sufficient conditions or even family resemblances, so I'd rather just talk about things we associate. And frankly, a lot of the talk is, to tell you the truth, is skimping on certain important issues, like the distinction between humility and modesty, if there is one, like the question, well, what's the contrast to humility? Is it pride? Is it arrogance? Is it ostentatiousness? All of these, pretentiousness, all of these questions, need to sort of be sorted out. I'm sort of going to use humility and modesty as if they were the same thing. I'm going to sort of work with rough and ready intuitions about what's arrogant and what's too proud and so forth. But here are the options for characterizing humility without characterizing it as ignorance of itself. Ignorance of itself. The first is to recognize God, and this is found very clearly in a number of quotations that we have, that to recognize God as the source of your traits and abilities. We speak about God-given talent, okay? And what it means to be humble is to recognize that you have achievements, but to also understand that your achievements come from God. Just to read you one quick quote, that people should not feel. Well, actually, that's the wrong quote. There's this idea that certain pride is legitimate, and the pride that's legitimate is a pride which is predicated on the fact that God is the grantor of the gifts. Sometimes see in college yearbooks, sometimes egotistical is described. They have these mottos. It says, "A self-made man worships the Creator." Here, you have to avoid worshiping your Creator. You also have to recognize. Now, let me also point out that it's tempting at first to associate those first two, right? Recognize God-given talent, and the next one, which is recognize that traits, abilities, and achievements are naught compared to God's. Once again, the theme from earlier. And now that allows for a qualified appreciation of yourself. The idea is that creating and controlling the universe is more impressive than getting tenure and so forth. It may seem that these first two, gratitude to God and recognizing that your traits and abilities are naught compared to God's, it may seem that these require a religious context. I don't think that's true, because I think there are ways of recognizing that what you achieve is not due solely to yourself, even if you don't believe in God. You can recognize a strong element of luck in in what you do. There's this question about does anybody deserve anything? And if they do, does anybody deserve to deserve? The sorts of questions that come in connection with roles. When you recognize, the kind of just luck that can project people into certain positions, it works. It's like, I tell people that when it comes to getting a job, people say keep your ears open. That's not true. You keep your lap open, because things fall onto your lap. You just don't know. So this doesn't have to be a specifically religious element. Now, the third characteristic here that I'm associating with humility is to recognize your flaws and limitations, what you do know, what you don't know. Of course, it's a little paradoxical here, because you can't know something and then not know it. But what I mean is, that certain areas just not inside your bailiwick. I notice in sports the locution has come up: stay within yourself, and I think that means acknowledge your limitations. And there's a lot of stuff nowadays, a lot of literature about failure in general. The next people defer to expertise if they're humble, as opposed to reading people who write on blogs. Okay, they do not mentally on their traits, abilities, and importance. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the founder of this Musar movement I mentioned before, the ethical movement, said that the idea behind humility is that you don't assign a great emotional valence to your achievements. And that's a very important thing. And certainly you don't assign more of a value to your achievements than anybody else's. Quotation, photos from C.S. Lewis, wasn't a direct quote, paraphrase. that it's okay to be proud of the cathedral that you designed, as long as you would be equally proud if someone else had designed it. Which leads me into the next one, which is to know and appreciate that others have valuable traits, abilities, and achievements, and the humble person holds them in esteem. A side question I had, which I didn't work out, is does this connect to altruism at all? They're tolerant and open-minded. That's my next. And an important point that was made by Norman Richards in 1988 in an article, he said, they retain these traits even in the face of temptations to inflate their egos, such as praise. It's a very interesting idea. In fact, he makes that concept very, very central, that the humble person is someone who doesn't succumb to the temptation of getting full of himself, even when people are saying these wonderful things about him. All of those are traits that can be associated with humility. There's no necessity to choose one from among them. You can choose a bunch. It is entirely possible that some of them are mutually exclusive. Okay, but this gives you sort of, I think, a list of characteristics to think about. Let me just raise quickly a couple of questions about what I just did there, and then move on to the final part of the talk. One question that comes up, we spoke before, I showed you the source that God's humility, that we are humble, we are imitating God. But you have to ask yourself, is God humble in the ways that were mentioned here? In the Bible, God certainly talks about himself, right? Says certain things, and the question is whether that, in and of itself, is an example where humility would not be a virtue. And God speaks about it is because he needs to exercise a certain authority over the people, or a certain leadership over the people. And this could be a case of that. The second thing is the question of myths as motivators. And here I would defer to anything Barbara has to say on this, since she's a practicing psychologist. But, it seems to me that sometimes people set up certain myths that help to motivate them. One example we saw already. The world was created for me. That's a way to motivate your action. There are some others, and go to page 6 again, and you'll see this kind of thing coming up in the passage in Maimonides. Maimonides occasionally uses formulations like this. He will tell you, for example, that human beings have free will. Anybody can become like Moses. Now, he doesn't believe that, okay? But he writes that. It's an inspirational thing. Now, look at this one. When he's speaking about repentance. It is necessary, he writes, number 4 on page 6, it is necessary that a person regard himself throughout the year as if he were half innocent and half guilty, and should regard all of humanity as half innocent and half guilty. If then he commits one more sin, he presses down the scale of guilty against himself and the whole world and causes his destruction. If he fulfills one commandment, he turns the scale of merit in his favor and in favor of the whole world and brings salvation and deliverance. Now, this is telling this person, listen, the whole world is in your hands. That's basically what it's saying. Now, of course, you can run this argument with anybody else who exists. So everybody's supposed to say this to themselves. So in a sense, the world doesn't really depend on anybody in particular. But this is a kind of motivating myth. And in this connection, I quoted Robert Browning, that a man's reach should exceed his grasp. I think that setting up these myths is a little complicated, because the question is it that you believe the myth? Is it that you believe the myth and you know it's a myth and yet somehow it motivates? Or is it that sort of temporarily when you're thinking of the myth, you're not really believing what you believed originally? I think it gets a little complicated, and I don't know quite how to work that out. And finally, there's a question which I didn't have listed here, which is, well, what do we want to say? I mean, granted that ignorance of your achievements is not necessary for humility. But suppose you have somebody who has a radical understatement of his or her activities. What if you have somebody who practices self-abnegation, self-abasement? So are they more humble than the other people? In other words, does it add to humility? Granted, humility is not a necessary condition, but is it something that sort of crowns it? Perhaps that's what's meant by the sage who said, and we saw this earlier, Maimonides agreed, that one should be very, very humble. Maybe that's what's meant. Or you could say that what exceedingly humble means, what very, very humble means, is just that you kind of put together all of these characteristics that I mentioned. To be very, very humble is to have all of these traits. You have some choices here as to how to look at it. But I think this question of whether you enhance your humility by not having a high estimation, I think that's an open question. In the final leg of this talk, which is not to say the talk is on its last legs, I hope, but it is to say I want to look at an issue that I really which I think is kind of left out of everything I did. Because I looked at the Jewish sources, I looked at what's going on in the analytic philosophy, but I think there are certain categories and certain issues about humility that are specifically questions about religious humility. And I want to turn to that. I'm going to give you 3 examples. Example number 1 has to do with theodicy. Okay? The professor I know asked the class, what does theodicy mean? And somebody wrote, it's a work by Homer. And that's not quite what this is about. There is a position in contemporary philosophy, particularly continental philosophy, which is called, John Hick's term, anti-theodicy. What anti-theodicy maintains is that there's something wrong or inappropriate when a believer tries to understand why God allows evil. In other words, the entire enterprise is flawed. And the question is, why is that enterprise flawed? Now, I think that there are roughly around 9 reasons that can be given, or have been given for this. But the 2 that are really most relevant, but I'll give you 2 that are most relevant to this. I think in terms of images here, maybe think of C.S. Lewis, the idea of God in the dock. God is being attacked. Now, people realize it's wrong to prosecute God in the dock. But what about defending God in the dock? Anti-theodicy says you can't defend God in the dock either. Again, there are many reasons, I said, but the 2 that I want to look at are, number 1, futility. In other words, you'll never come up with the answer. Now, if you refrain from theodicizing because you feel you'll never come up with the answer, okay, if that's your reason, then that fits perfectly the traits of humility, right? You recognize what you can't know, and you don't claim to know. In fact, you don't investigate. So that one, I think the issues about humility are more or less clear. The second argument, though, is less clear. The second argument has to do with presumptuousness. I think a good place to look for this is some writing by Merrill Westphal, who presents this. There's something presumptuous, brazen, audacious, it's chutzpah, right, to try to understand God's ways. And what this represents here is, this is a lot different from saying there are things I can't know. What you're saying is, look, I could know if I tried, maybe I could figure it out, but somehow I'm not supposed to go there. And so you have a limitation on your knowledge that is self-imposed. It's like this idea of forbidden knowledge. Yeah, you're just not supposed to go there. The question is, why aren't you supposed to go there? I mean, what is actually wrong with what's wrong with this approach? I mean, what's wrong about thinking about why God allows evil? There are 2 main things that I think come up. One is the idea that you are reading God's mind, and that there's something of chutzpah, there's something brazen in attempting to read God's mind. It's not entirely clear how to take this argument, because after all, in a sense, when you are reading texts, you're trying to read God's mind. I mean, the more you think that the texts are removed from the divine and are in human hands, the less this becomes an issue. But in some sense or other, you're interpreting God's word, you're trying to read God's mind. I'm assuming he has some sort of authorial intent, understanding of the text. The second thing that you're doing, which is probably worse, is the idea of judging God. In other words, when you come up with theodicy, you're saying, this is, here's the reason God allows evil, and it's really a very good reason. Well, that's evaluating God. We're supposed to stand in judgment before God. He is not supposed to stand in judgment before us. And so the argument goes, therefore, it is audacious or it is chutzpah to try to judge God. Now, there are ways to try to get around this. For example, Peter von Inwagen has a distinction between a theodicy and a defense. A theodicy, when you give a theodicy, you're saying, here's why God allows evil. When you give a defense, you're merely saying, here's a possibility as to why God could allow evil. So you're kind of hedging your bets. Now, personally, I think that defenses collapse into theodicies. I don't know if you could play this game very long, in other words. But even if this explains why, that you're not reading God's mind when you give a theodicy, I think that the element of judgment is going to be there somehow or other. So we are sort of left then with this argument that that there is something audacious about reading God's mind and judging God. Well, it seems to me that if you accept those premises, if you accept them, okay, I may have expressed a little doubt on them, but let's say you do accept them, then I think you have to conclude that within religious traditions, humility can be trumped. Here is what I mean. First of all, when you praise God for what he has done, you are judging his products. You are making a judgment about God. So that would be an example of arrogance. If you maintain that judging God and reading his mind are arrogant. Every time you look at teleology in nature, aren't you making a judgment that this is a good world? Secondly, in our traditions, we offer theodicies. Contrary to what the argument militates, okay, we do offer theodicies. So if it is arrogant to offer theodicies, then we have to conclude that in religious life, we are arrogant. Why do we offer theodicies? Well, those are questions that can be asked. I have a quotation I won't have time to get into that somehow it kind of really clarifies in your mind what it means for God to be just. And that sort of would override this charge of arrogance. But the fact remains then that humility is still trumped. In other words, it's still, what I mean to say before, is it's still arrogant, but there's a good reason for the arrogance. So those are two examples, okay, where reading God's mind or judging, or it's praising God and offering theodicies. But there's a third thing which I don't know if it's unique to Judaism, but I have seen the claim that Christianity does not have this, but here I have to rely on experts and not on myself. In Judaism, there is a very large protest literature where people protest God. Now, some of this is shared by Christianity because because it's in the Hebrew Bible. Abraham challenges God. Abraham says, "How could you want to destroy all the people of Sodom, even the innocent people? Shall the judge of the earth not act justly?" Moses tries to talk God out of punishing the Israelites. That happens all the time. Jeremiah has a remarkable chapter. Jeremiah 12 starts off by saying, where Jeremiah says, "Look, I know you're going to win, but I'm going to argue with you." Okay? That's the way the chapter begins. Job. On one reading of Job, and admittedly there are many, but on one reading, here's what's happening. Job is challenging God. Job can even come near blasphemy. The friends are defending God's justice. And what happens in the end in the last chapter? God says to the friends who were defending God, he says, "I am angry at you. And because you did not speak properly about me like Job did." In other words, God kind of welcomes Job's protest on that reading. There are other readings, but that I think, it's a strong element. There is a remarkable text in the rabbis, in the Midrash, where God calls Abraham, Moses, and Rachel into court, and he's litigating against them. And in the end, they litigate against him, and Rachel wins the argument. And finally, what does she say? I think she speaks about the fact that she could have married Jacob, but instead she gave... what is it?
She speaks about the fact that she didn't want her sister to be humiliated.
Right.
That in bed, Jacob would know.
Right. So therefore he gave her... Right.
So she hid under the bed.
Yeah.
First of all, she gave her the code.
Yeah.
What to say.
Right.
And then she hid under the bed. Something in her voice, or her sister's voice, so you never know. And she says to God, if I could do that, then how can you be upset about
you'd be upset with me, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's what I meant. No, she allowed, she allowed basically Jacob to be married to Leah for 7 years. The most remarkable passage I know on this is a passage in the Talmud where God has been described as Gadol Gibar V'no Ra, great, mighty, and awesome. And because the temple had been taken over by Israel's enemies who were celebrating, therefore Jeremiah refused to say the word awesome. And Daniel, who was thinking of the Babylonian exile, omitted the encomium mighty. There is no suggestion in the Talmud that there was something for which they ought to be punished. They seem to have done it with impunity. Of course, question arises, what accounts for this? I mean, why? What gave Abraham the right to challenge Jeremiah and Daniel to delete the attributes, Moses and Rachel to litigate? Why did the sages of the Talmud legitimate reactions like these? I think it's entirely possible that they found the reactions so understandable, so natural, and so difficult to resist that they legitimized them. And, maybe more important, they must have recognized that these kinds of sentiments, the upsetness about the status of the people, for example, they recognize that they are coming from a good place. They're coming from empathy, they're coming from devotion to the temple and the Jewish people, they're coming from moral sensitivity, and that's why they're protesting. Not protesting, being humble in this regard, not being arrogant here, shows moral apathy, and it shows a lack of existential identification. To accept the standard formula of attributes, Gadol Gibar V'no Ra, in the face of evil, is, in a sense, perhaps, to acquiesce to evil. And that may be why protesting is welcome. There are other ways to handle some of these things. Certainly there are texts that squelch protest when Moses asks, why is the great sage Rabbi Akiva suffering? So God says to him, shtok, which means shut up, don't ask any questions. And there are texts like that. And, in general, in Judaism, for every text there is an opposite text. But there's certainly this trend, and it's quite striking. I mean, there are other ways in which you could try to diminish this sense of arrogance in investigating God and judging God. John Hick has suggested this. I would just rattle this off, that even while investigating, one can attain humility by 1. Approaching the task with a measure of trepidation. 2. Recognizing that one's theodicies are tentative, fallible, and revisable. 3. Engaging in questioning, posing questions rather than challenging, although remember the protest literature challenges, and not making belief or faith contingent on finding an answer. And you might posit a distinction between understanding and judgment. There's understanding God's ways and judging them. But I think that this protest literature kind of, isn't really met completely by that approach. So in these cases then, by raising theodicies, even by praising God, by protesting, it seems to be that these are cases of justifiable arrogance. Okay. I'll give you now, in the remaining time, my 2 more examples. One example is a case that seems quite different, and yet it isn't completely different. It's the case of legal decision-making. There's a conception of Judaism according to which, sort of everything can be looked up in the text and that's it. It's not true. There's a tremendous, fantastic amount of legal reasoning that takes place. A life-level system, you look at precedents, you look at analogies, you have all sorts of inferences, and it leads, as we saw in the earlier text, why I looked at the earlier text, leads to a lot of debate. The question is whether by investigating, by trying to come to a ruling, are you trying to be as good as God? In other words, how do you know that your ruling is going to match God's ruling? And what if you have a tremendous responsibility as an authority on Jewish law? What if you're inept? What if you don't come to the right answer? And the way the Talmud deals with this is essentially the following. And here are three statements on the sheet that you have here at the top of page 3. The judge has only what his eyes see. The Torah is not in heaven. And these and those are the words of the living God. The judge has only what his eyes see. In other words, you make the decision based on your best guess, your best estimation, and that's okay. The strategy here is basically to lower the epistemic bar, to make it possible to say this is a good decision, even if it doesn't match God's decision. And that's why there's even a story in the Talmud where a heavenly voice comes down and says, this is the law, but the people down below are debating what the law is, and ein mashgichim bevat kol, which means we don't listen to a heavenly voice when it comes to deciding law. People are to decide according to their best reason. Here's what I think is a very moving example of this on page 5, quote number 11. In quote number 11 on page 5, this is from one of the great Jewish legal authorities in the 20th century, Rabbi Moses Feinstein. It's from his introduction to a multi-volume work of Jewish law called Responsa. There's questions, questions about Jewish law posed to him, and he responds with answers. It's also interesting in general to see how rabbinic responses are composed. There's all sorts of language like, well, it appears according to my impoverished understanding that such and such, things like I didn't merit understanding, instead of just trouncing with you, I didn't merit understanding, and so forth. It's written very quickly. But here you see the tension between, on the one hand, needing to issue a ruling, and on the other hand, the fear of not matching God's ruling. Quote number 11, second sentence. But as regards truth in issuing a ruling, already it is stated in the Torah, the Torah, is not in heaven. What appears to a learned person as the correct order propound, after he examined the law appropriately to clarify what is in the Talmud and poskim. Poskim means the previous authorities, to the best of his ability, and with reverence and fear or awe of God, this is truth with respect to issuing a ruling. And he must issue a ruling even if it is apparent in heaven that this is not the correct interpretation. About this it is said that his words too are the words of the living God, insofar as his ruling is the interpretation as he sees it, and his words are not contradictory. He will receive reward for his ruling, even though the truth is otherwise. And if the judge perhaps says, why do I need all this anguish? In other words, I'm so fearful, this is a tremendous responsibility. One must rule even if it is not the exact truth. And then finally, every Torah scholar will examine what I say. Those people will look and they'll discern for himself, he says, whether to rule thus. We'll see if they agree. He knows that he needs to come with a ruling. He also approaches it with a trepidation. But this idea that he's not expected to match God's ruling is what enables him here to take on the ruling. Here the strategy seems to be to preserve the humility. Here it's not a case of his being arrogant. Rather, you're preserving humility because you recognize it's not God's rule. You recognize that you're allowed to rule only because God gave you a dispensation to look at it as how you see it. You also know that other people are going to rule differently. That's the way in which to deal with this tension here between, on the one hand, the humility of not making a ruling and the fear of not getting it right. The last example I want to give you in the remaining time before concluding that is a story about a guy who was going on too long, and he saw that the audience was fidgeting, and somebody said, and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have a watch." Somebody says, "Well, there's a calendar behind you." The last example of this is the case of ethics. There are certain ways in which we think about ethics, Jewish ethics, that kind of lend themselves to an inflated sense of self. First is the concept of imitatio Dei, that when we act in the world, and in Judaism this applied to development of science and technology and economics and politics, when we act in the world, we are imitating God. There's also one I left out, which is we are in the image of God. Right? That can lead to a great sense of grandiosity on the part of human beings. There's also one idea in Judaism that we are partners with God in the work of creation, meaning God deliberately leaves the world imperfect, and you know who's going to fix it? Us. We're going to fix it. He didn't perfect it. We are the ones who are going to perfect it. There's also the idea sometimes of momentous opportunity. Now there are some people who think that the world is waiting with bated breath for the next article that they write. That's not what I'm talking about. There are times in history, and Judaism often stresses that, look, you're in a particular place and you've got to act. Mordechai stresses this to Queen Esther, that if you don't act, salvation will have to come from somewhere else and your household will be destroyed. All of these things can psychologically lead to inflated egos. It doesn't mean that they have to, because as long as you approach these with a sense of perspective, in other words, as long as you realize that imitation of God doesn't mean you're God, as long as you realize that you're the junior partner and you're not that important, look, if you wrote a book together with Quine, for example, in logic you'd feel pretty important, but the idea is you look at this as a perspective, you realize that you're not really doing this, and so too with the sense of momentous opportunity. I mean, you can just realize that you're fortunate to have the opportunity and yet take on the responsibility. But I think that beyond that, there are certain elements in Judaism that actually try to provide a counterbalance to this sort of thing. One is a quote that I have here from Rabbi Tarfon, who says, "You are not required to complete the task, yet you are not free to withdraw from it." Which may imply that you're not capable of finishing, and you don't have to finish the task, but at the same time you have the responsibility. There's the idea in Ecclesiastes, two is better than one. A great quote from Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik that what we call civilization is the sum total of community efforts through the millennia. I heard a story that Mahatma Gandhi was asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And he said, "I think it would be a good idea." Has anybody heard that? I thought it was, it's a clever remark, but I never verified where it came from. I mean, so one element in this is telling people that they can finish the work. The other is the recognition of divine providence, the way in which God enters into the world to crown our efforts. It is very appropriate in Judaism when you want to say, "I'm going to do such and such tomorrow," you say, "Im Yirtzeh Hashem," meaning if God wants, which is now abbreviated, everything gets abbreviated, IYH. There is a Jewish religious professor who teaches philosophy of logic, and he sent an assignment sheet to his class, and he wrote, "Next week we will IYH do Quine's theory," or whatever it was, if God willing. We also are told in the Talmud and Medrash that we can't imitate all of God's attributes properly. That's another limitation. And finally, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, one of the leading Jewish thinkers in the 20th century, Rabbi Soloveitchik has a different point about it. That this is what I call a disjoined dialectic, where submission, the idea of submission to God's will, surrender of your intellect, surrender of emotion, surrender of appetite, counterbalances all of these ego-inflating possibilities, even though it's disjoint, meaning it's not that you're curbing your technological efforts, it's that in another context, you are being submissive. So you experience what he calls both majesty and humility. There, I think, then, with the proper perspective and with these proper counterbalances, you are not necessarily led into arrogance. So, to sum up, then, getting back to my original question of thought, right? Is humility always a virtue? Well, there are cases where humility is trumped. We saw this. The Torah scholar has to have that 1/8 of arrogance. Possibly when someone takes on the job of ruling for the community. the competitiveness of scholars. I haven't really related competitiveness to humility, but I'm sure you can see how a line could go. And the need for a motivating myth. Or it's something about yourself. It's something that I think we sometimes tell kids. Imagine you can get 100, and then you'll get a 90. If you imagine you get a 90, you'll get a 75. That sort of thing. When we create these myths for ourselves, and whether we believe them or not, is a question of race. With theodicy, there is a certain amount of audacity that Jewish tradition allows that trumps humility, and I suggested that comes out of a fear of moral complacency or moral indifference or indifference to the suffering of the people. In legal decision making, you preserve humility by lowering the epistemic bar. And finally, I mentioned that in ethics, either a sense of perspective or some of these counterbalancing texts can do it. I spoke about imitatio Dei, and theologians say that God is outside of time. And now, like God, I am out of time. Thank you very much.